Yama, hello. My name is Chontel Gibson and I'm a Kamilaroi woman with cultural connections to the Collarenebri area in Australia. Today, I'm presenting on a topic in relation to valuing Indigenous people's health and wellbeing in early childcare services. I'm recording this presentation on Kamilaroi country. The image on the screen is of a tree on Kamilaroi country near Collarenebri. I pay my respects for elders past and present, many of whom have had a profound impact on my life, including the work in today's presentation. I acknowledge fellow Indigenous people in Australia and across the globe, whose knowledges and practices are often contextualised to cultural and/or geographical areas, collective in nature, holistic, and adaptive to contemporary issues. You can see on the AIATSIS Indigenous map of Australia that the Kamilaroi Nation is nearly one of 300 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. There are significantly diverse cultural ways of knowing, being and doing for each of these nations. There are also commonalities across the nations. It is important to understand that the term Indigenous is not a term that I generally use unless I'm speaking in an international context. I generally use terms such as Aboriginal people, Kamilaroi people, Wiradjuri people, and more, as these terms are respectful to the geographical areas where I live. On the screen, you can see two images. One is a smaller section of the map on the previous screen, and the other is of me. I'm an occupational therapist with a Master's in Public Health and a PhD in Aboriginal Health and Wellbeing. I work in the Good for Kids, Good for Life team from the Hunter New England Local Health District in New South Wales Health. The Local Health District is spread across multiple Aboriginal nations highlighted on the screen. I'm the project manager for a small team who supports early childhood education and care services to implement health promoting activities in line with Munch and Move. Munch and Move is a New South Wales health initiative that supports the healthy development of children aged birth to 5 years by promoting physical activity and healthy eating. I also conduct research, mostly relating to Aboriginal health and wellbeing. My presentation will illustrate a strengths-based approach for early childhood education and care services who work with Indigenous people. The aim of the approach is to co-design health-promoting activities with children, families and communities. The strengths-based approach was developed on Wiradjuri country in a regional town. The project involved working with older Aboriginal people to design, implement and evaluate the project. The details of the project can be found in the article on the screen, which is called Sharing and Valuing Older Aboriginal People's Voices About Social and Emotional Wellbeing Services, a Strengths-Based Approach for Service Providers. The co-authors of the article include myself, my PhD supervisors, Pat Dudgeon, Judith Crockett and Marie Bernoth. Michelle Lincoln is also a co-author. Many of the Munch and Move resources are designed for non-Indigenous and able-bodied families. My team uses a strength-based approach to understand how best to work with and encourage early childhood education and care services to implement culturally appropriate health promoting activities. The strength-based approach is decolonising in nature as it encourages service providers to value the voices of Indigenous people, develop partnerships with Indigenous people so that they are involved in key decision-making processes, reflect on their own values and beliefs which may stem from broader contexts, transform ways of working, breaking down barriers of inequities, discrimination and injustices. The decolonising nature of this strength-based approach is its advantage when implemented. Each of the dimensions on the screen support implementation, and I will now take you through each of them. Dimension 1, listen respectfully. Listening respectfully involves taking an inquisitive and action-orientated approach to understand how health and wellbeing are expressed and experienced. Indigenous peoples' health and wellbeing is often holistic in nature and embedded in connections with family, country, culture, and spirituality. Consider listening and acting on responses from questions that are listening and understanding about health and wellbeing, such as, what does our service need to know to support health and wellbeing? What does healthy eating mean for you? How could our service celebrate or acknowledge culturally significant events? In the image on the screen, you can see a handout that our team disseminated to the services. It provides information relating to a culturally significant event. It encourages services to connect with children and families to understand how to celebrate the event. And finally, it provides some health promoting activities which were developed by Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander people. Respectfully listening moves away from assumptions and forms the basis of building connections and communicating appropriately. Dimension 2, build genuine connections. Build rapport and connections with families and children when they first connect to your service. Listening respectfully will assist in maintaining ongoing connections. Additionally, connect and engage local Indigenous organisations, such as community-controlled organisations like Aboriginal Medical Services. Indigenous organisations play an important role in the health and wellbeing of Indigenous people. Building relationships and partnerships with Indigenous children, families and communities is a long process and includes things like connecting with each other, which often involves sharing something personal about yourself, agreeing on what is important and what you will work on together, attending local cultural events and/or expos where Indigenous organisations come together, learning about previous partnerships in the area, using appropriate communication processes, and more. Dimension 3, use appropriate communication processes. Indigenous people are a diverse population, and as such, so are communication styles and preferences. If you are unsure, it is best to connect with Indigenous organisations and families to discuss local preferences. Identifying your own communication biases will support the breaking down of any power imbalances. Finally, communicate in ways that conveys value and respect for Indigenous people. Ideas to build shared communication approaches and processes include asking questions like, how can we best communicate? How can we co-design health-promoting resources? And how can we change what we do to better value Indigenous people? In the image on the screen, you can see an acknowledgement of country, which is customary for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. It also recognises the Aboriginal country where the service is located. It supports Aboriginal children's identity, and finally, it creates opportunities to support the awareness of non-Indigenous children about Indigenous people. Dimension 4, apply an Indigenous human rights approach. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights for Indigenous Peoples, from herein called the Declaration, is an important document. It illustrates the minimum standards for survival, dignity, security, and well-being of Indigenous people. Read the Declaration and then implement it in partnership with Indigenous people. In Australia, there is the Community Guide for the Declaration, which can also support the implementation of each article in the Declaration. A few of the many examples of how you might implement Indigenous human rights include support local and diverse Indigenous perspectives of language, culture and spiritual identities, ensure decision-making processes include informed consent, are free from coercion, and that all relevant information is provided, and develop educational and health information for children and families that reflect the dignity and diversity of Indigenous peoples, be that Indigenous peoples' cultures, histories, experiences, and/or hopes. Indigenous people have all the rights set out in the Declaration, as well as rights found in other declarations. Importantly, the Declaration acknowledges the unique positioning and specific rights of Indigenous people who are traditional owners of their nations. Dimension 5. Critically reflect on political, social and historical contexts. It is essential to critically reflect on political, social and historical contexts at a local level and at a national level. For example, in the early to mid-1900s, in line with the government's policies that supported segregation, my grandmother, many of her brothers and sisters, and other families in our community were not allowed to attend the government school because of their Aboriginal identity. Aboriginal children were eventually allowed to attend the school. Then their experiences reflected another government policy area of assimilation. The belief that Aboriginal people were viewed as inferior continued. Such a belief is seen in one of my grand's stories. At the government school, she had to make sure she achieved exam results that were lower than her non-Aboriginal peers. Today, many things are different. There are policies and education practices that promote the being, belonging and becoming of all children. However, some things have not changed. For example, racism remains in the fabric of the Australian society. Today, I call each of you to think about your positioning in your nation's political, social and historical contexts. What privileges do you hold and how can you use your workplace as an avenue to work collaboratively with Indigenous people to value Indigenous health and wellbeing? Furthermore, it is important to consider how these contexts influence families and children at a local level. Dimension 6. Evaluate the process and outcomes. An evaluation process that values Indigenous perspectives is critical. Megan Williams' Ngā Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander framework can be used to consider partnerships between services and Indigenous people. The Ngā evaluation framework moves away from an outcomes and efficiencies-based approach and instead uses a holistic approach, which focuses on respecting the landscape, like looking at the broader context where the program is located, such as policies and the impact of colonisation on local communities. Ways of working, looking at the delivery aspect of programs and types of activities, relationships, principles and accountability mechanisms. Resources, looking at all resources, be that financial, human in kind, material and more. Learnings, looking at two things, assessing the extent in which the partnership objectives were met, as well as insights gained by all stakeholders. Ensuring an Indigenous lens and focus of an evaluation will allow you and your service to better understand what is working, why it is working, and the issues that you need to address. Now that we've gone through each of the dimensions of the strengths-based approach, let's look at some helpful hints that will get you started and/or strengthen your current strengths-based approach. Make the time to do the groundwork, like building partnerships. What work you do in the early stages will save you time in the later stages. Be comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. Reflect on your feelings and practices by keeping a journal. Use these reflections to take action. Ensure that staff undertake professional development courses to better understand Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. This will decrease placing unnecessary burden on partners. Start small with transformations. Every action counts, and the more actions you take, the bigger impact you will have. On the screen is a Good for Kids Facebook post that uses an existing Aboriginal resource made by, with and for Aboriginal people. Watch other Indigenous presenters at this conference, including my sister Cherie Dean's presentation. Cherie's presentation will illustrate an Indigenous education aspect framework, which will provide more practical advice on how to embed Indigenous perspectives. In this presentation, I've presented a strengths-based framework for valuing Indigenous people along with Indigenous health and wellbeing. A strengths-based approach illustrates the importance of connecting with Indigenous people to embed local and diverse Indigenous knowledges. Just as important is the ability of the service provider to understand how they are positioned within the context that they work and live. While some of the broader issues may seem too big to solve, it is important that you take active steps to do what you can in your service and/or industry.